Psychosis can be pretty hard to identify when you don't know what you're looking at, and unless you've had prior experience with it, you could easily mistake it for any number of things, none of which would be psychosis. A lot of people thought that I was on drugs or that I was just overly dramatic, and people didn't realize that what I was going through was actually a mental illness. Looking back on it now, it's fairly clear to me that what I was going through was a psychotic episode, but I didn't have the knowledge or the language or the experience back then to understand that that's what was happening. So I'm going to look back on it now with what I've gained in my 10 plus years living with schizoaffective disorder to discern what really happened in my first episode. Just some fun facts to start with. The prodromal phase of psychosis is the onset of psychosis. It is one of 3 phases of psychosis, and in the prodromal phase, a person will begin to experience negative symptoms which look a lot like depressive symptoms. They are symptoms like becoming withdrawn, isolating, lack of personal hygiene, falling behind in school and work, stuff like that. And this onset, the prodromal phase, tends to set on around the age of like adolescence to early to mid 20s with men, and the early 20s to mid 30s with women. My first episode happened when I was 18 years old, so I think I was coming up to that age range, and it was fairly natural for that to happen. Although marijuana tends to exacerbate psychosis and can trigger psychotic episodes in people. I had started using marijuana around the time of my first episode. So while yes, this is a natural occurring disorder for me, it was exacerbated by the marijuana use, and I believe that is part of what triggered the onset. Also, stress can trigger psychosis, and I had a lot of stress going on in my life. My parents had recently divorced. Both of my paternal grandparents had died within a year of each other. I had come out of my first abusive relationship. The abuse itself was very stressful. On top of that, once I broke up with him, he began stalking me. That was very stressful. I was failing in school because I was too preoccupied with all this other shit going on to really want to even give a fuck. So I was failing out of school. I was about to be kicked out of school. There was a lot going on getting in the way of my mental health. If I had to pinpoint the first symptom, it would have to be the delusions. And I mean, aside from the negative symptoms, which were understandably easy to hide given all of the other stuff going on that was incredibly depressing in my life, the delusions really stand out because I thought that I was just particularly spooked by Halloween that year. My psychosis came on around Halloween, and I was just having these fearsome beliefs that carried outside of the movies I was watching, that carried with me throughout the day, and it was like I couldn't shake these fears. One delusion I had was that my cat was Freddy Krueger, and I knew logically that that was irrational, but I couldn't shake that belief, and I was afraid to be in the room with my cat. There was always on some level a conscience that I had that knew what was happening wasn't real. But there's still no negating that false reality when it approaches. I can tell myself, yeah, no, I'm hearing voices, those aren't real. But it won't turn off the voices, and the voices will sound just as real whether I believe in them or not. So logically, I can say this isn't really happening, but it doesn't stop it from happening. I just knew that I was way more afraid of this belief of my cat being Freddy Krueger than I should be. Because like I said, on the one hand, I knew it was a false belief, but it gripped me and I could not get rid of that false belief. And I had this irrational fear that was huge. It was huge, and I couldn't be left alone in the room with my cat. I had a hard time being left alone at all, really, and I remember that I was wandering pretty early on in my first episode. And wandering is something that I tend to do in all of my episodes. Wandering will just be me taking off and leaving and wandering and wandering and wandering for hours and miles until someone stops me. I will just go. I'll walk and walk and walk and walk. And usually it'll be the police that have to pick me up. Sometimes I think I've stopped on my own just out of exhaustion, but I have gone as long as 12 hours wandering before, I think is the longest I've wandered. Maybe longer, I don't know. And I was wandering in my first episode. I was home alone one night and I think I was working on some homework or something, and it was October. It was cold out and it was nighttime, and all I was wearing was a tank top and jeans, and I freaked out. I felt like the walls were breathing. The way that lungs expand and contract, I felt like the walls of my house were breathing, and it was terrifying. So I panicked. I could not be left alone, and I just took off. I left my house with no destination in mind, and I walked and I walked and walked for a few miles before I reached a horse farm and just sort of stopped and realized, what the fuck am I doing? Where am I going? Like, why did I leave? Why am I doing this? I don't know. What is going on? I eventually got up and walked all the way back home, and when I got home, my family was freaking out. Apparently, they thought that I had gone to a party, and they went to this kid's party and crashed their party looking for me, thinking that I was just being defiant and that I just wanted to get drunk and party. And again, I had a reputation for things like partying that I didn't actually do, that were actually related to my mental illness. And this was one of those instances where instead of, this very clear wandering spell being related to mental illness, it was mistaken for an attention-seeking behavior, or I don't know what you'd want to call it, but it was definitely not seen as mental illness. So that just kind of got cast off as me being dramatic, me looking for attention. When they didn't find me at the party, they did still come up with some way of rationalizing this behavior that was not at all mental illness. The next clearest symptom that comes to mind is the auditory hallucinations. I had hallucinations of people walking around my bedroom, and that really stood out because that was the first time that I really doubted my sanity. I was lying in bed and I was trying to fall asleep, but I kept hearing chatter. Like all of my friends were in my room with me, talking with each other, and it was so articulate. I could pinpoint where in the room they were and at what volume they were talking, and they were speaking at different volumes. There were multiple conversations happening. I could hear people walking across the room. I could trace their voice, the location of it, and I could hear the floorboards in my room creaking with their footsteps. It was so realistic, and I thought that there's no way I could have been imagining that, but I had to be, because what could that possibly be if I wasn't imagining that? I had a suspicion that what I was hearing was a hallucination, but I didn't really know what a hallucination was. So I just told myself, stop imagining it and it'll go away, and then you'll prove to yourself that this isn't real. Well, I couldn't stop myself from imagining it. I just thought maybe I had an incredibly vivid imagination, but I couldn't stop thinking about it as hard as I tried. And that was when I started to kind of look into what is going on in my head. At this point, I had been having delusions for a few months. The first one with my cat, the Freddy Krueger thing, that was the earliest I could identify what a delusion was, but I had been having these feelings and these beliefs going back for months. I had been having trouble with the wandering, making it home from school. I would take really long routes getting home from school, often because I was paranoid, so paranoid, thinking that cars were following me, that I was being spied on, and I would have to look over my shoulder constantly to see if there was someone following me. So I was starting to become aware that I was paranoid, I was having these weird thoughts where I was believing things, and now I'm hearing voices in my room. What is going on? I looked up all of these things, and the result was psychosis. And I understood, that made sense, but I didn't do anything with this. I didn't do anything with this immediately because I didn't think there was anything that could be done. I didn't have an open communication type relationship with my parents where I was comfortable telling them things that were important. I had very bad luck trying to get them to take my mental health seriously, or rather, I don't know if I'd call that luck, but I had no success up until that point having my mental health taken seriously. So this was not something I felt I could really go to them with, and I sat on it for a while, and it just got worse and worse and worse. What drove me to actually get help was when the delusions became violent, and that's when I knew something had to be done. I was having delusions that I had taken my ceramics tools, which are like sharp cutters, carving into clay type tools, and I had gouged out my face. And I would look in the mirror and see my face intact, and I would know that that couldn't have possibly happened, but the belief was so strong and it was still there that I really couldn't tell. I didn't know if I had carved out my face or not. That was terrifying. And then that was followed by the delusion that I had killed my dog. And that broke my heart. I could not live with myself if I had killed my dog. And I realized at that point I did not want to sit on this any longer. Something had to be done. So I went to my parents and I said, look, I know I didn't kill our dog, but I believe that I killed our dog. Something is not right. I need help. I need to go to the hospital now. They took me to the hospital, and all along the way there, the band U2 had been a huge problem for me. I had a delusion that U2 was following me, and there was like U2 music playing on the radio on the way to the hospital, and it was just so foreboding. So I really needed to go. I still struggle with listening to U2 today. I actually haven't listened to U2 since that episode, and that was in 2010. So it was a struggle. It was a struggle getting there, but I got there. I made it to the hospital. And once I got to the hospital staff really didn't believe me. They didn't think that a person with psychosis could articulate what was happening to them, because one of the symptoms of psychosis is lacking in awareness of your symptoms. And because I didn't have that symptom, they didn't believe me. They didn't think that I was actually psychotic. They humored me though. They put me on meds. That's all I really needed, honestly. But I did not get the diagnosis that I needed. I was misdiagnosed, and I held on to my bipolar type 2 diagnosis. I did not get my schizoaffective diagnosis until my next episode years later, when it was much, much, much worse. Most of the time in the hospital, I was acting just as normal as the other people there. So the other people didn't even realize that I was psychotic. And I actually had a roommate who, she'd say, well, if you're psychotic, then why do you seem fine? And I'd say, well, I'm not fine. I'm definitely not okay. That's why I'm here. And she'd say, okay, so like if you're psychotic, then like prove it. And I'd tell her, okay, well, I can hear a car engine revving in the corner of our room up here on the 3rd floor right now as we speak. Does that prove it? So I was still hearing things, and I was having delusions, but it was easier in the hospital because there was activity and I wasn't alone all the time. One of the issues being psychotic early on was that I spent a lot of time alone at home by myself. My siblings all had activities. My parents both worked and were divorced. So when I was home by myself, that's when the delusions would be their scariest, being surrounded by other people who were also getting help made it a lot easier for me to at least ignore them to a degree and not be so fixated on what was happening in my head. I can't remember when exactly the episode ended, but the medication was effective and I did come out of psychosis and stayed out of psychosis for a couple of years until my next episode. So it was mild. It was a mild episode, but it was still an episode, and it was still enough that it was the beginnings of a long journey. My psychosis has been a lot worse than that, like a hell of a lot worse than that, but that is still just as serious. First episode psychosis is a thing. There are programs in place throughout America to treat first episode psychosis because the belief is that if you can treat it early enough in the first episode, you can shut it down. And I could have been that person. I could have had that success. I did not, because no one thought I was psychotic. No one believed me. I almost didn't believe me. But, you know, there are interventions in place today to help people come out of psychosis in their first episode to give them a better prognosis. So my psychosis, in a sense, was serious in the sense that, like, it should have been taken seriously. And I could have spared myself a lot of brain damage if I had actually been heard the first time around. Any case of psychosis is serious. Any and all cases of psychosis should be taken seriously. So just because someone doesn't have the anosognosia that tells them that they're not actually psychotic, they still should be heard. You know, if you know you're psychotic and you're psychotic, you're still psychotic. There's nothing taking away from that. I think it was unfair that I wasn't treated properly, or at least given the proper diagnosis that could have prevented a lot worse episodes happening later on, just because I was so aware of my condition. Anyway, that was what my first episode of psychosis was like. I'm really proud of myself for getting to the place that I can actually like look back and identify some of the things that happened, because a lot of the things that happened I still didn't really know were psychosis for years later, just because like the wandering away from home, I was a behavioral kid and that was, you know, dramatic. So I can see how I might have gone the rest of my life not seeing that as a symptom of a very clear mental illness, but it was. So yeah, just my 2 cents on my first episode with psychosis. Anyway, today is Monday. This is my new upload schedule. I'll be posting on Mondays from now on, so you can look forward to more videos from me in the future every Monday forthcoming.